Association. I would like to welcome, we have a bunch of members on today as well as some guests that are joining. We as an association, we offer this webinar series at least once a month, sometimes twice a month on a wide range of topics. The topic that we're going to discuss today is extremely timely, and we're gonna jump into that. But before we do so, just a couple quick housekeeping items. You all, from an attendee perspective, are going to be on mute here today. With that being said, we encourage you to ask questions, and the way that you can do that is by using the question feature in GoToWebinar to type them in. What we're going to do, Whitney and John and Brad have agreed if a question comes in during the presentation that's relevant, we're going to kind of pause and hopefully address that. And then if we, once we get to the end as well, we'll go through questions. But please, we encourage, we've done a lot of these in the past. These webinars are always better when there's dialogue back and forth. So, and this is certainly a new program in terms of what's rolling out. So please ask questions. If there is something that's really specific to your company and you want to connect with the team from ChargePoint after the fact, we can absolutely do that, and we can help you in that regard. I'm sure the team will be sharing their contact information as well. But please ask questions. There's no bad questions here. We encourage you to do that. So with that being said, I'm going to give a really light intro here. The NEVI program was a part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill that allotted $7.5 billion to build out EV infrastructure. It's going to be divvied out into the various states. Pennsylvania specifically is receiving $171.5 million in funding that's going to be allocated over the next few years to build out EV infrastructure along major travel corridors throughout the state. We have today ChargePoint, who is a member of our association, who's really specialized in the EV charging space. They have a really great, just national, with how involved they are from a national perspective as relates to NEVI, as well as other programs such as Driving PA Forward, to really be able to speak on this and hopefully give you all just additional insight as you look at this grant opportunity in the future. So with that being said, I'd like to pass it off to John, who's going to introduce the rest of the team here.
Hey, thanks, Ted. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for joining us this morning. Grateful to Ted and PPA for giving us this forum. I'm John Scher. I'm the Director of Retail Fueling and Convenience. Just a brief background on me and my role. I spent the last 20 plus years in the industry. The last 5 years, almost 5 years, I ran the New England Convenience Store and Energy Marketers Association, which is the PPA equivalent up in New England. A lot of advocacy work to create a landscape that's fruitful for all of you and your businesses. And prior to that, I helped run my family's business, which was a company called Mutual Oil. We were a jobber up in New England, branded and unbranded, marketed from Maine down into the mid-Atlantic, and ran a fleet of about 20 trucks. So been in the industry a long time, understand it pretty well. ChargePoint was a member of Nexima. Always loved what they were doing, thought they were a leader, now know they are a leader, and was thrilled to accept a role with them last year. What do I do? In a nutshell, just imagine me sitting in between the company and the customer. Our customers need products and services that work for them, programs that work for them, and the company needs a subject matter expert. So I kind of go back and forth between that. I sit across policy, sales, programs, marketing, product. So really everything that touches the convenience channel. With me today is Whitney Schmidt, who is enterprise sales for and really running NEVI for the Eastern US, a real expert on the NEVI program, and Brad Norman, who is manager strategic incentive programs. Nobody knows where the money is or how to get it better than this guy. I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit more. The only thing I want to add to what Ted said is that a lot of people know what NEVI is. What most people don't appreciate and what we hope to accomplish today is describe the complicated nature of how to go out there, what the states are looking for, particularly Pennsylvania, and how to win that money. It probably won't be a ChargePoint commercial, but we certainly welcome you to reach out to us after this call so that we can develop a partnership with you so that we can help you win your fair share or unfair share of the state's money. With that, I'll turn it over to Whitney if you want to do a quick intro, and then maybe Brad, and then we can get started.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. I think John did a great job. I have been with ChargePoint for running up on 8 years now, have put in a ton of DC fast and L2 charging, primarily in the Southeast, but as John mentioned, I'm now responsible for the eastern half of the United States. And I know a lot about NEVI. I know a lot about cross-functional deployment in general. And am happy to answer any questions. So Brad, want to do a quick introduction and then we'll get started.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Brad Norman, as John mentioned, I'm leading the large incentive strategies across North America, which is encompassing of all utility, state, and federal funding. Obviously, NEVI is a big focus as we turn to the alternative fuel corridors, and the VW funding is kind of going into the sunset. My job day to day is I'm an educator and enabler. I want to share the best practices. Prior to coming to ChargePoint 2 years ago, I led Georgia Power's EV charging infrastructure from a utility standpoint. I've installed hundreds of fast chargers and kind of understand what is that secret sauce, so to speak, and best practices from a design standpoint, but also how do we leverage this outside funding to reduce risk and accelerate payback.
All right, thank you very much, Brad. So let's jump in. If you all do have questions, I'm assuming they go into this little question panel right here. If Brad and John, while I'm talking or while you're talking, if we could all kind of watch that right there, that would be great so that we don't miss any questions. All right, so what we are going to look at today are a couple of things. We're going to look at EV growth in general, the Pennsylvania NEVI program, electric vehicle supply equipment, that's what EVSE stands for, and the fueling and convenience market, and strategies and best practices, both in and out of NEVI, because a lot of them are the same, to get this stuff installed. And we'll talk about why that might be important. I think that it is probably not news to anyone at this point that EV sales and demand are really accelerating at a very fast pace. OEMs are putting in more and more money to EV electric vehicles. Here you can see some of the 2030 sales targets of these various OEMs. We're looking at Mercedes, for example, wants 100% of their vehicles to be electric in 2030. Tesla, obviously, the same way. Tesla's never done anything but electric, but we've got some pretty high numbers on some of these other organizations as well. Volvo is well on their way. So what does this mean? We've all seen the companies announce things and then they don't do them. This is really happening. And what this means is that we are at an inflection point in transportation and in fueling transportation. And that inflection point means that the way that we fuel is going to change. And the way that that change comes about is in what is available in the marketplace. And so we're seeing that happen very, very actively. It is accelerating far faster than anyone predicted even 5 years ago. Here are some numbers. This is just a quick map on battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles across the country. There's Pennsylvania highlighted. This is as of Q2 of 2022, and you can sort of see where everyone stacks up in the country. Kind of predictable, you know, northern flyover states is where the population density is a little lower, is less. We've had lots of incentives around the Gulf and around most of the coast, tons of incentives in the Northeast. And of course, Brad and I have been in the Southeast, so those numbers are going up as well. Here they are stack ranked. You can see where Pennsylvania is, not too shabby. There's a lot of states in this country, and Pennsylvania is right up there, making a really great showing with other states that are very strong in electric vehicles on the road in their state. All right, so what does that mean with regard to the NEVI program? Brad, I'm going to let you go ahead and take this one and talk about NEVI from a national standpoint really briefly, and then let's drill down on Pennsylvania.
Sure. So as many know, this funding is to be spent over a 5-year period, and it's going to be rolled out in multiple phases. Now, there are 52 programs, Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. And based on the work that ChargePoint's policy is doing to work with each state DOT to understand where they are and kind of the framework of their program, it's clear to see that no two programs are the same. I will hand it to Pennsylvania and the work that they've done. They've got one of the more well thought out programs in our perspective, and really appreciate what they've done to get out as much information early on. But the first years of the funding is going to be directed to the alternative fuel corridors, the AFCs. These are corridors that are nominated by each state's DOT annually for that recognition. And once they are, notice at the federal level that they are those alternative fuel corridors, they are then primed for these first rounds of NEVI dollars. And so the overarching goal is to have public-facing infrastructure that is the kind of the framework of all NEVI dollars, irregardless of the year or the phase. For the first phase in alt fuel corridors, it's every 50 miles they want to have public-facing infrastructure to really build out a national network. And again, to the credit of what Pennsylvania has done, and really appreciate how they've gone about their gap analysis. Again, and keeping in mind that the goal of stations every 50 miles, there's a foundational infrastructure already in the ground that meets those NEVI requirements, and we'll probably get into that later on in the deck. But there are existing stations that satisfy the requirements of NEVI, and that serves as the foundation. And then from there, it's a mathematical exercise of evaluating where's that commercial density and where are those eligible exits that are primed to fill those gaps. And so what we're looking at here is an image that has been provided by Pennsylvania DOT that shows how they've prioritized those corridor gaps or those corridor groupings. And so the green really being the priority area 1, those help satisfy that infrastructure gaps. And then as you go down the list to 2 and 3, you're getting closer to that existing infrastructure and obviously not as high as a priority.
Thank you. And I was in a meeting yesterday in a different state with a DOT, and there were some really good questions asked that I think apply to all states, and kind of reminded me that not everyone intuitively understands how or why these programs are working this way. And Pennsylvania, I will say, has probably put some of the most thought into the layout of this infrastructure. So the goal is to never have a gap of more than 50 miles between DC fast charging stations. And that the reason for that goal, among other things, the primary reason for that goal is so that people will be comfortable with electric vehicle adoption, and so that they will always have a safe place to stop with amenities, kind of mimicking the fueling experience that they have right now. And so 50 miles is a pretty good clip. It addresses most battery capacities and how people charge. So where these typically in most states are being allowed or prioritized is what makes that gap better. So we don't necessarily want a bunch of DC fast chargers all on top of each other just because they're in a municipal area. And we don't want to forget about the rural areas as infrastructure enablers, just because people maybe are perceived not to be there. This is meant to be a well thought out, well placed infrastructure that addresses all of those needs. So thank you, Brad, for that. So John, I'm going to go ahead and let you take the next couple of slides and talk about electric vehicle charging stations and the fueling and convenience market and what that might mean for the future of your evolving customers.
Sure, thanks. I like to say that the convenience industry is in the business of serving customers, the motoring public, your customers, with the products and services they need when they need the most, often when they need the most on the go. And this is just an evolution of that. Nobody's saying gasoline isn't going to be around for quite a while. I personally believe it will. I think most people do as well. But this is electric vehicle, serving electric vehicles is growing. And it's something that customers expect to see at the place where they fuel today. So this is not an or. This isn't gas or electric. This is gas and electric for the foreseeable future. And And so I think that's an important distinction to make, because I've had a lot of conversations with people that sort of put up the defenses immediately, and I personally think that that's the wrong approach. I think that this is an important thing to be at least be looking at, understanding that the growth is there, as Whitney showed on some earlier slides. And kind of the exciting thing about it is this: today, a gas customer pulls in. I mean, my personal experience is once a week, and you're there for 4.5 minutes, and maybe you go into the store, maybe you don't, but you're visiting the store once for, let's call it 5 minutes. With electric vehicles in the public, it's a very different type of customer experience. They're either going to be coming to fill up, and if they do, from 20 typically to 80%, because that's when the rate of charge drops off dramatically at 80%. You're talking 25 minutes, maybe even longer, depending on the vehicle. That's a much longer dwell time. That introduces all sorts of opportunities that maybe don't exist with a customer who's there for only 5 minutes. Or it's a top-off model where the customer doesn't have the ability to charge either at home or at work, and because you're a trusted supplier of all the products and services that they've needed over the years, they continue to come to you now for electricity. And so now they're there more frequently for, again, longer periods of time. And that also introduces a very interesting dynamic in which you can start to think about how you want to serve that customer. And I don't want to pretend to know your business as well as you do in terms of what that means. It certainly depends on the company. It certainly depends on the region. But some of these things that are evolving now, like prepared foods, like this is going to be an example of something that's going to continue to be more and more important into the future. So the takeaway is it's an and, not an or, and the customer is going to be there longer and potentially more frequently.
Thanks, John. And we are, believe it or not, going to dig back into that a little bit later. So let's look at how everything that John just talked about and everything with NEVI may affect the state of Pennsylvania and how you all operate. So I'm going to talk about why you may want to do this. And like I said, we'll come back around relative to what the forecasts are and what we're seeing actually happening. So this is the state of Pennsylvania forecast by 2030. This was done back in 2021, and it was 136,000 EVs by 2030. Now, this is, I dug very deeply into this data yesterday. This is battery electric vehicles. So this is 100% battery vehicles, but that is not nearly, that's only half of the market. There's a whole nother half of the market that is still electric, but also runs on traditional fuel. What if growth is faster? So in that last scenario, this is the growth, and this is from a number of places, Guidehouse, Navigant, and a few others. So here is what the growth has been. If we're underestimating is what I am implying is happening here. Right now, there are actually 55,142 vehicles on the road in Pennsylvania that can plug in to an EV charging station. So if we start with that number and look at the actual numbers for year-over-year growth in Pennsylvania for everything that has a plug, 47.21 from 2020 to 2021, that's sort of obvious reasons for that dip, and then again 45%. And this is under a supremely constrained supply chain. So this is not even as many vehicles as they could sell if all of the vehicles they could sell were available. If we do just 35% year-over-year growth, we're not looking at 136,000 vehicles that can take a plug in Pennsylvania by 2030. We're looking at closer to 600,000. So here is that sort of represented a different way. We've got the forecast there, the forecast here, and here is that number right there. So if growth is even faster than anyone is planning on, and history tells us it will be faster than what we're planning on now, what does that mean for your evolving customer now in that context? So average dwell time is 36 minutes. John, I'm going to let you jump in here again and talk a little bit more on a drilled down basis. what that evolving customer, now that we've looked at some numbers that may be a little bit different, could mean again for these fueling and convenience stores.
Yeah, so just building on what I was saying before, how the customer finds charging is super important. In-dash technology is important. The number of app downloads out there is important. And the companies are now, meaning your companies, are going to have opportunities to reach out to those customers now in a way, as they're out there motoring around, in a way that maybe you don't today. So loyalty becomes super important. The types of partnerships, some of the public announcements that we've had with OEMs and others become really important, and marrying up those brands that might have a vested interest in reaching out to those electric vehicle drivers, companies that might have sustainability goals, companies that might have ESG initiatives, marketing companies that want to demonstrate a certain view about where they're going. And so all of these things become really important and opportunities for the convenience companies. And that's something that I can't speak for other companies, but that's something that we're thinking an awful lot about, how to, as Brad said earlier, enable our customers to benefit most from this transition to electric vehicles. But here you can see down in those last two bullets there, that the in-vehicle navigation system takes drivers to stations, as I said, and then once you're there, integrating a driver from the ChargePoint or any EV ecosystem into the ecosystem of the convenience retailer is crucial, and creates all sorts of opportunities for that convenience retailer.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And John, I actually have a question for you, and I'm springing this on you, but it just kind of occurred to me as we're going through this and some of the meetings that I've been having, in this meeting that I had yesterday, as somebody who's been in the fueling industry for a really long time and seeing how this is ramping up very, very quickly. Do you see, or how do you feel about the opportunity for integrating this? You were saying it's an and, not an or, into the current business and the future business of fueling and convenience. Is it different than what you thought it would be? Can you just kind of give, and I'm totally springing this on you, can you kind of give some commentary on maybe what you thought was coming and now what you think is coming, and how folks can look at integrating that and how they should maybe view that in their business?
You know, one thing, and you are springing it on me, if that's okay. One thing that I sort of, before I knew more about what I know, I always imagined that DC fast charging would one day get down to 4 minutes, just like a gas. And now I'm not convinced that will happen. But that's okay. And as I said earlier, I think that that's kind of cool, because I think it creates opportunities that don't exist today for that customer. I'm sorry, for the retailer. You know, the other thing I think that's also important is, today, convenience and fueling has a monopoly on fueling. You can't get gas at a dollar. Well, I don't think you can get gas at any dollar stores out there, right? And so, or a Best Buy, for example. But the truth is that there's going to be charging opportunities at other retailers, and so. And it's not necessarily all going to be DC. It's going to be a mix of level 2 and DC. And what I think is important is that convenience retailers understand a couple of things. First, if you make a decision today, chances are nothing happens for 12 months or so, for a variety of reasons. And also, this infrastructure is going to be built up to some degree around you, and that also depends on where utilization is higher, et cetera. But it's a lot easier to develop habits than it is to change habits. And the NEVI funding and a lot of other funding out there right now is making future-proofed high-speed charging affordable in a way that without the incentives, it would not be. And so for companies that are sort of sitting on the sideline thinking, well, you know, I might want to kind of wait on this a little bit, I think there's a real risk to that. Now, certainly that's a way to go, and companies have their reasons, but the opportunity to get in with some of this future-proofed equipment at deeply subsidized prices, and more importantly, to develop the habits of your customers today as they're transitioning, is is really important to at least seriously consider.
Thank you. That was an excellent answer, and I appreciate it because I am not new to ChargePoint. I've been here a long time, but I am newer to the fueling and convenience space, and learning how this really can meld two worlds is amazing, and take advantage of all of those opportunities as you mentioned. So let's dig into we're kind of going to go back and forth just a little bit. What are the power requirements of this incentive opportunity? And Brad, I'd like for you to talk a little bit, without talking about us kind of specifically, what the power requirements are as far as, 150 kilowatts, maybe a little bit about what's the difference between a port and a station and how we're handling that, and some other things that are important about the NEVI requirements and what that means for building out a site. I will tell you, we've got some more specifics later, but let's start here and then we'll layer that in so that we can kind of get to it twice, if you will.
Sure. So I'll try to my best not to make this a ChargePoint commercial, but I do want to call out some of the nuances associated with strategy for this funding and how ChargePoint helps that strategy. But to the minimum baseline design requirements to meet NEVI is that you have to have 4 ports, meaning 4 CCS connectors. That could be 4 individual dispensers, or it could be 2 dispensers with 2 ports on it, as you see depicted here. It really depends on that charging manufacturer's hardware and the capabilities to move power between those ports. But the minimum is you got to charge 4 cars at one time, and those stations have to be capable of providing up to 150 kW of power to a single vehicle. That's quite the transition that we've seen from the early days of VW back in, I don't know, starting in 5 years ago, where 50 kW was kind of the baseline minimum. And we've seen that quickly escalate as the vehicle technology has improved from 400 volt vehicles that can take fast charge, but at a lower speed, to now 800 volt stations that can take that 350, 400 kW, depending on the manufacturer, and a whole host of other parameters on what might limit their charging speed. But minimum baseline design for NEVI is 4 ports and 150 kW each. One of the, I guess, best practices and lessons learned through a variety of large incentives is exceeding minimums, right? So what ChargePoint is doing for that is our baseline design, just by nature of the architecture of our engineering, is that we have 160 kW per port, but we're really recommending clients in the right locations, in the right markets, and where the numbers work out is to provide those stations at 200 kW each. And because of the architecture of ChargePoint and that we move power between dispensers as opposed to a 1-to-1 ratio where it could potentially be a stranded asset or stranded energy and capital investment, is we have 400 kW available day one to a single vehicle without any need to future-proof for additional hardware or cost of install or labor down the road. And so from a ChargePoint perspective, is that you have 2 dispensers with 4 ports. They're providing simultaneous chargings, and behind the scenes, where I guess all the magic happens on these high-powered stations, and this is true for most manufacturers, that there's an auxiliary power cabinet that kind of sits with the secondary gear, as you see depicted here at the center of your screen. That power cabinet is what takes on the AC-DC conversion. And again, ChargePoint's modular architecture is there are power modules that slide inside of there, up to 5 of them, to achieve that 200 kW, 40 kW each, or 800 kW on a site.
Thank you. I want to make a comment too, and this also has come out of some things that I've heard. This modular design, any modular design and scalable design, does a couple of things. It creates the ability to future-proof, as Brad said, in an industry where people kind of don't feel like they know what is going to happen in the future. We do this every day. We're very comfortable with how this is going to go, but we totally get that this is new to almost the entire population and certainly to operators. So scalability, a track record of that scalability and of project execution, uptime, and things like that are going to be really important. And then this modular design, wherever one can get it, really contributes to resilience, not in the solar and battery power kind of way, but in the, if one thing goes wrong, we want to have redundancy built into these systems so that the system continues to be usable and folks can benefit from that even while something is being very, very quickly replaced because of modular.
If I could jump back into that, Whitney. So
yeah,
I guess pro tip or strategy or best practice for any charging deployment, whether it's level 2 or it's DC charging, which is probably more applicable to the fuel and convenience space, is to one, future-proof and scale as the utilization data gives you that guidance that it's appropriate to add more power or more dispensers. Redundancy, ChargePoint does that through our design, and that we have redundant in fans. We may only need 2, but there's 3 built in just in case one goes down. But one of the pro tips I would say from looking at just the hardware only, and if you're looking at hardware only, you're missing 3 other key components I'm sure we'll talk about, but that service and support aspect. From a hardware only thing, pay attention to the amperage of the cable. Just because a station says it's capable of high powered, but if it's put in with a 200 amp cable, it's going to downrate the power that's delivered to that station, right? So you can have all this power available, but that cable, that cord set that's attached to that dispenser, if it doesn't have the right amperage, when ChargePoint solves this with liquid cooled cable up to 500 amps, you're going to be limited on actually how much power. So 150 is not always 150 delivered to a car, depending on the amperage of that cable. And if PennDOT's on the call and hears that, I hope you take note of that or are aware of it.
Not always about what it says it can do. We've got UL listing and NEC that are governing that, as I'm sure you know.
Whitney, I want to add one little thing, and you said it, but I want to make sure it wasn't missed, and that is the I was talking with a channel partner, so we sell through our channel partners, and the question came up, well, I don't want to, I'm getting a lot of questions, meaning they were getting questions from their customers. I'm a little nervous about buying something and then the technology changes and I'm going to have a stranded asset. What they both said, what Whitney and Brad, is that the future-proof and the scalability and the future-proof capabilities of this equipment is super important to note. You can scale up with this equipment so that it is not going to be a stranded asset. As cars are able to take faster rates of charge, so can these dispensers deliver it. And while we're talking about NEVI here, and this is the NEVI solution, this equipment can be used for non-NEVI purposes as well. So while NEVI is super future-proofed, once we get through NEVI, there are opportunities to buy this equipment, and you will still have the ability to use it well into the future as cars are able to take faster rates of charge. So the scalability and future-proofness of this is very, very important.
That is absolutely true. And I'm going to put a pin in a term because we've got some design slides just a little bit later. And that is fleet fueling, heavy fleet fueling. So we'll talk about that in a minute as well. I'm going to do this really quickly because I want to make sure that we have time for questions and time for actual design work and things like that. A lot of times we'll look at things and people will say, I'm not gonna do anything here. There's no cars here. Heck, there's no people here. I pulled some data from some stations. This one happens to be in Pennsylvania. This is a public-facing DC fast in East Earl. There's 1 or 2, not exactly in East Earl, but really, really close by. So this is some data over the past year. This is in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with a population of a little over 96,000. I'm sorry, these are AC level 2 stations. The DC fast were behind the fence, now that I'm remembering. These dots, the star represents the station. These red pins represent the zip code of the home zip code of the driver that used the station. I can't tell you the driver's name. I can't tell you their address, but they do share with us this zip code. So what I've done here is I've mapped over the course of the year, where did the customers come from? Where did the drivers come from that used this station in East Earl, Pennsylvania, in 96,000 person Lancaster County? And they did come from all over the country, and we like that these guys are coming from that far. That's probably not a repeat customer. Here are the ones that we see that are the customers that we really want to track. And those are the guys coming down through New York. They're making their way down. If this were just a little bit bigger, you'd see that this goes into Baltimore, goes a little bit west. We get a little bit of a hiccup there where, down here. But you have got people coming to a location they're not working there. They may be visiting family there, but they're using this EV charging station from pretty far away. And this is level 2. So as you can see, what this demonstrates is it's not just about the people around you. Here's another station in Oriental, North Carolina. This one, if you know North Carolina at all, is a little bit more predictable. Oriental is a sailboating community. It's on the water in North Carolina, very summer oriented. And what we start seeing in the summer is folks coming from Raleigh down to Oriental and using those stations. There are almost no EVs registered in Oriental, North Carolina, but they're coming from Raleigh and a little bit in Charlotte, which has a ton of EVs registered. Hamlet, North Carolina. Man, there's nothing in Hamlet. Hamlet has a train station. It has some good restaurants, but it's not somewhere I would travel. It is on the way to the beach. So you can see that folks we got a little bit of stuff right here, a little bit of augmentation from out of state, but you can see if we really studied this closely, that folks are traveling from Charlotte through Hamlet down to the beach probably, and then from this Raleigh area as well down to the beach. So it's not just about the EVs in your area. All right, Brad, I'm going to let you go to town a little on this. I want to talk about how you can make planning. I just want to give you a look at what's next. How you can make planning and consideration for where and how to deploy EV charging relative to this NEVI funding work for you. And Brad, I'm going to let you start on this slide. And if you need me to pop back and forth with that other slide, just let me know and I'll be happy to do it.
Okay, so short leash here. Maybe we approach this from the get to knows, or why NEVI or DC charging might not be the right fit. We understand that it aligns with the application of that traditional fueling experience, and the goal is to drive business in the store, connect communities, enable adoption, as a lot of these programs are built around. But there's really key 3 drivers from a business decision on from an ROI standpoint, right? This is a business decision to deploy charging as a value-added amenity. There's 3 key drivers there. First and foremost is utilization. If nobody's using the stations, there's no driver revenue. You don't have a way to offset your operating expenses, your energy charges. The second one is going to be demand fees from utility. If you know anything about commercial rates, there's typically 2, there's a lot of factors, but there's 2 main ones we pay attention to. One is the energy cost. Think of that as your odometer on your car. That's the pennies per kilowatt hour you use. Really not so much interested in that, but what I am very paying attention to is the demand fee. Think of that as your speedometer on your car. How fast do you ratchet up from an energy standpoint? The utilities are going to charge you for that. And not all utilities are created equal in terms of what they charge those programs. We are seeing utilities come with new and innovative rate structures based on EV charging that mitigates those demand fees. But demand fees can make or break a project from an OpEx standpoint. And then the viability of outside funding, right? This could be both the federal funding at NEVI and or the combination thereof of utility incentives that might have make-ready dollars or a rebate, but so long as that you've got your 20% cost share from a context of NEVI. But those 3 key things work together to drive whether the station is going to be profitable or not. Typically, we look at that as an average of 10 years. ChargePoint's built some really innovative tools beyond the ArcGIS mapping that kind of aligns with what the NEVI gap analysis looks like, but we really drive down into to understand what is that traffic count, that commercial density from an amenity standpoint, year-over-year growth. There's just so many factors that go into what makes a site prioritize, and we do that a lot of that on a portfolio analysis standpoint. So even though you may have a site that's geographically prime and aligns with the state's gap analysis, there's a number of factors on why that site may not be viable. And we talked about the utility component and the demand rates might be a factor, but one of the biggest reasons I'm seeing projects not viable for NEVI is that these are big, large, and complicated projects that require a significant amount of real estate. At a minimum, with 4 ports, 4 parking spaces, plus the need to have accessibility from an ADA standpoint, you're looking at 5 parking stalls that you're dedicating to EV charging, publicly accessible 24/7. And then you need all that green space or maybe additional parking for a new distribution asset, a transformer from the utility, a large secondary gear, and then you've got those power blocks we talked about before. These projects are roughly $1 million in the ground, ballpark, right, before any incentives. And so that too is another get to know. But what we really like to see the industry transition to is how do we mimic the traditional fueling experience for drivers that's a pull-through design, right? And that's something that states are paying attention to, as more vehicles that come from the consumer market, trucks and SUVs and pulling toys and trailers and boats and whatnot. There is a need to evaluate the pull-through design to support those, and maybe one day those medium-duty trucks from a fleet application. The challenge with that pull-through design is that takes up even more real estate, and it typically has a higher cost because now you're having to bore or trench deeper into a parcel. So just from a real estate perspective, these are fairly large space requirements. Angled parking, it'll work. It's not preferred. Understand that, that's representative on the bottom photo there. It's a little bit hard to see, but not every manufacturer has the port where you plug the vehicle into in the same place on the car. And so from an angled parking, that's typically a one-way drive aisle. And from a safety perspective, really not advising customers to try to back into that scenario, especially if you have a drive-through in close proximity. Angle parking will work. It's not preferred. Parallel parking, it'll work. It's challenging because it's hard to keep customers from going over the line that's trying to separate those parking stalls, and then you've got core reach issues, and typically parallel, you've got a standard flow of traffic onto that site. So we've done parallel, we've done angled parking. They're challenging, not preferred. Kind of the baseline design today is that pull-in back-in model, but we'd really like to see that market transition to mimic the traditional fueling experience, drive-through.
Absolutely. Brad, I heard a couple of questions yesterday that I think people think about and maybe we take for granted. With these NEVI and really any high power installation for charging, number one, is it possible that there will already be enough electrical capacity and distribution assets on the site to make that work? And number two, just really quickly, what are some strategies and things we should be just checkboxing in rural areas that may have more infrastructure challenges from the utility side? And is that something that the site host can mitigate in an application or when they're thinking about how to deploy?
Right. Awesome questions. Yeah, so typically in the fueling convenience space, your service from that utility is provided at 208 voltage. There may be some very large truck stops at 480 voltage, but historically, those transformers that were sized to serve that C-store are not going to be large enough or have the ability to upgrade to the necessary voltage and the size requirements of these stations. So we're looking at a 750 to 1,000 kVA at 480 volt, as opposed to what might be serving a C-store at 208 volts. So just the voltage difference alone is reason why we would want separate distribution assets. And again, back to the utility rate structure, as utilities are looking at new rates dedicated to just EV charging or low load factors, there's a reason why you'd want that separately metered. The question about are you going to have sufficient capacity? The voltage question aside, if you were to think of like a large retail center, a Walmart, a Target, or a Kroger, they are served at 480, but that distribution asset is typically behind the store, not in the parking spaces. And so that cost to get to that parking would be problematic. That secondary gear for ChargePoint's NEVI design is 1,600 amps. Few, if any, ever are going to have 1,600 amps of spare capacity sitting in their panel of their business. And so what that means, again, is that it is more cost efficient to build new. The other question you had about rural electrification and what should we be looking for? Three-phase power availability, right? So I've got a project in Kentucky I'm working on. The utility to bring three-phase to that convenience store would require 4 poles and 3 spans of wire at added $150,000 from the utility side that they would pass on that customer. That added cost is a burden in of itself, but the utility just doesn't have three-phase at that site. So we're looking for three-phase distribution on site or in close proximity. Most fuel and convenience operations are going to be served at three-phase, specifically if you've got any food prep in there or large HVAC systems. Happy to look at your site and tell you yes or no. You can very clearly look at the distribution from Google Earth to verify that. But yes, if you have single phase in a rural area, that is problematic for such a large scale fast charging deployment.
And we have seen solutions. They can be a little bit cost prohibitive, but there are solutions. It does make it more difficult to to deploy. So all is not lost, but if there's 3-phase there, that greatly enhances the ability to.
The alternative to bringing in 3-phase is adding a single-phase booster or a battery storage station with a step-up transformer. To Whitney's point, you're looking at a $500,000 additional cost. We've got a few of those projects in Whitney's state of North Carolina right now, and it's challenging. More real estate needed as well.
So it depends on how much money you have, I guess. Let's look at this really quickly, and let me just, I don't think there are any questions sitting in there right now. This is a sample site. This is a real life Google Earth of what Brad was just talking about. Brad, do you kind of want to walk us through this site to take a look? I think this is about right. You want to walk us through and just look at it from an Earth view instead of our cartoon?
Yeah, this is actually a real project I worked on last year. You may have seen the Volvo Starbucks announcement with ChargePoint was involved with, but this is what I was talking about earlier, is that where number 1 is located behind that Starbucks, that is a 3-phase 208 volt transformer serving the store. Again, we need 480 volt distribution, and so we put that burden on the utility to bring in that new service, so long as that their rules allow for that. And then so number 2 is a new 480 volt transformer. 3, representative of your new secondary gear. Think your very large panel that you would have in your house. That's 1,600 to 2,000 amps of capacity. You've got your auxiliary power blocks. And then where do you have those 5 parking stalls? Again, 4 parking stalls dedicated to EV. We typically merge 2 stalls together if we're figuring they're 8 to 9 feet wide to get an 11-foot stall with a 5-foot access aisle. Path of travel, depending on the jurisdiction, is a requirement. Try not to talk about it because it can kill a lot of projects based on slope and how far you got to go. But if path of travel is needed to the retail establishment, we certainly look at that as well. What you're typically going to find from a cost effectiveness standpoint is that it is more cost effective to deploy infrastructure on the perimeter of your parking as opposed to deep inside your lot, taking up that prime parking, and that's likely to be blocked by that F-350 truck along the storefront, is what I would refer to as the apron, right? So the cost effectiveness from the utility and where's the real estate to accommodate all of this gear is typically going to be found on the perimeter of the store. We don't have an example of a pull-through design on here, Whitney, do we?
No, I don't have an overhead of pull-through.
Gotcha. Yep. And if you've got a drive-through, that's the holy grail for a lot of businesses. You know, there's a lot of best practices. Stay away from the drive-through. We do not want drivers backing into parking stalls and interfering with customers trying to get through that drive-through space. So stay away from drive-through, stay away from underground fuel storage and vent stacks. Propane racks, you know, we can move those if necessary, but there is kind of an art and science as it relates to design.
And I'll add, you know, Brad talked about staying away from underground storage tank fills and vent stacks. NFPA is going through a process now to look at the different regulations about where this electric vehicle infrastructure can be installed. So we don't know what that's going to look like yet, but the further away you can be from them, I think just in general, the better. First, and then second, it's a balance, right? It is going to be more cost effective to put it on the perimeter of the property, but at the same time, you want to enable your customers to come into the store as well. So just be thoughtful about both of those things.
Hey guys, sorry to interrupt, but we have had a couple questions that have come in, and I missed them on my end, so I apologize. John, you just essentially took the one that came in. I'm going to read this here really quickly. Several of your pictures show electric chargers under the same canopy as a gasoline dispenser. Are there liability concerns with this layout? Curious if any insurance companies have given their blessing on adding electric to an existing gasoline island.
So I don't know where Whitney just went, is what I don't know, but I also don't know if we had any slides that showed electric vehicle infrastructure underneath the same canopy as a gas pump. Perhaps the very first slide looked a little bit like that, but that wasn't the intention. So the answer to Brad, I mean, Whitney, I don't believe so, that there are any examples of EV dispensers alongside gas pumps, certainly under the same canopy. And as far as NFPA is concerned, that's going to be frowned upon. That I can almost guarantee. I don't know what the setback requirements will ultimately settle in at, where some of them are talking about now is fairly draconian. I don't expect that that's where we'll end up, but to have them alongside gas pumps or on top of fills is probably not allowed, and second, probably not a good idea.
I am seeing some designs in the West Coast where they are putting it under the canopy, but it is 30 feet or more than any of the fueling dispensers or tanks, right? So you're not going to have them side by side with the fueling pump, but it's going to be its own island, under the canopy, typically on the perimeter. Now, I don't know why we haven't recognized the need of canopies in EV charging as it is in the fueling space, and why that's lagged to kind of take off as a standard.
Because electricity and rain doesn't alarm anyone. And actually, electricity and EV charges. While I say that, I mean, I'm joking. There is actually no concern. Not that you should stand out in the rain and plug your car in, nor do you want to stand out in the rain and plug your car in. We love canopies, whether they are solar or otherwise, over EV charging stations. There is absolutely no safety concern with doing that, because there is, back up into a little bit of engineering. Once a vehicle is plugged in, on a typical gasoline pump, you control that flow. The gasoline will flow whether or not you're in the tank, and can get everywhere, it can go in the right place. You're in charge of that. With electric vehicle charging, the vehicle and the charging station, after that is plugged in, it's not powered at all when it's not plugged in. Not that you'd want to, but you could cut the cord, nothing would happen to you. It's not energized. Once you plug it in, there is a handshake that happens between the vehicle and the EV charging station software. And that handshake can take anywhere from about 3 seconds to 10 or 15 seconds, depending on what's going on, to complete. That handshake says, hey, I want this voltage. Do you have that? The charging station says, absolutely. The vehicle says, are we a match? The charging station says, we sure are. And then energy starts flowing. It is of no danger to the person standing there, even if they are wet, even if it is actively raining, which we don't want, but if it's happening, none of that is a danger, because charging will not begin until it is safe to do so.
Thank you. There's 2 more questions. One, I think is going to be more appropriate to hold to the end.
Okay.
But if you guys could speak on this, this is a good question. Just interested to get your insight as it relates to other PA clients. Currently in Pennsylvania, it's illegal to operate a fueling dispenser that is unmanned. How will this be addressed with unmanned EV stations moving forward? Are you aware of any Department of Labor, essentially? I'm sure there's different nuances in different states, but can you just speak on that broadly, either John or Whitney or anyone, or Brad?
John, I'm going to let you take that.
The answer, I believe, is no, and I would probably be OSHA that would look at that. But that's the beauty of it. Once that connection's made, you can go in the store and hang out for 20 minutes and have a sandwich and get on the free Wi-Fi. That's the beauty of it. And I think that's also, to Brad's point earlier, why canopies, for whatever reason, probably aren't in the fore of installations. That said, I think an enterprising entrepreneur is probably going to come up with a pretty good concept for that. I think it introduces opportunities for advertising and maybe a better customer experience. But that's my answer. Brad, anything to add?
Yeah. So the question is, does it have to be manned? Meaning that does someone have to be at the store? Someone behind the counter operating at that fueling site 24/7 while the stations are there. I have not seen that. We take into consideration from a safety and accessibility standpoint. We've got the ADA compliancy. We've got the bollards of the wheel stops from a safety standpoint from vehicular collision. Best practice is to have an external disconnect, what might be commonly referred to as an emergency stop in the fueling space, but an emergency disconnect within line of sight of those charging stations, so that should a customer need to disengage or a utility professional, they can quickly power off the stations without having to get into the panels or the transformer, things of that nature. But I've never run across that, and put in hundreds of fast chargers across the country.
Yeah, and I think supporting that is the fact that you see chargers, high speed and level 2s on opposite sides of properties from retailers. There's no way there's line of sight. So yeah, correct. And forgive me for missing the point of the question, but with many states, and I don't know what the law is in Pennsylvania, but in many states, you need to have 2 attendants, one always at the register, always within line of sight of the gas pumps. But I do not believe that is the case with charging. That's for sure.
And it is important the stations are monitored 24/7. Every couple of minutes they're sending a communication back to ChargePoint, at least on our network. So we're proactively monitoring, is the station operational, and doing remote diagnostics and dispatch if needed. But there's also 24-hour customer support. So if you operate from 5 to 11 p.m. and you're closing those nighttime hours and someone needs to pull a charge at 2 a.m., again, we're making sure that it's safe, it's well lit location, but there's someone available to help that customer on the phone if necessary.
And Brad, I just want to clarify, by monitoring, unlike gas stations, we do not mean somebody on site. ChargePoint handles that. Most should handle that. It's something that should be part of any successful bid for funding, is that the stations are monitored through software 24/7, just like you would an alarm system or something like that. And the whole point is, if someone were to pull up during the closed hours of the business, they can still get a charge. It is still completely safe. No human being needs to be there to monitor them. I'm just going to really quick point this out because we have just a couple of minutes and I want to get to that last question. We've gone over the site analysis process. Planning makes a difference. Reviewing designs, looking to see if there is a match there between the design and the funding availability, and if the site is a good candidate. And here's your picture you were talking about before. That's a rendering actually on this one, so I can say that that's 30 feet and let it be true.
Whitney, I've got to jump in here because we talked about what does it take to win, and that last slide about that project due diligence.
Yep.
There is an enormous amount of work that needs to be done yesterday to evaluate your sites and begin that coordination to make sure that you're going to meet the requirements of NEVI. And we're happy to help with that, but a lot of that's going to be looking at that preliminary site, that portfolio analysis, one, making sure you're eligible. Are the sites capable of hosting such a large project? Early utility engagement. And I thank Pennsylvania providing those contacts and that early utility awareness so that when they get these requests, they can mobilize and provide not only confirmation that they serve the site and they have 3-phase power, but they can provide that cost of service, because that utility distribution cost is just another component of the build of the project. So early due diligence. If you're waiting for the RFP to release, you are late to the dance. We should be looking at these sites yesterday.
Thank you, Brad. Ted, do we have time for that final question? Well, it's just at 10 o'clock.
Yeah, we do.
I've got time.
All right, so yeah, and to our member that asked that question, it's a good takeaway on our end. We will talk to a few of our state agency partners to get just to kind of get their read on that. But thank you to the team from ChargePoint that kind of gave us some different perspective there. So we actually had another question come in. So we have 2 questions here. One, I'm going to read the original one. If EV sales continue, and this was kind of back earlier in your presentation, I think, Whitney, when you're talking about trends and projections. If EV sales continue to increase at the rate you show, and the charging infrastructure is going to take 5 years to build out, where will customers charge in the meantime? So kind of that, this kind of somewhat of a chicken and the egg type of, topic here. Can you just kind of give your take on that?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a good question. We've actually been in this situation for the last 8 years. There have always been more EVs than charging stations by a lot. We call it port attach rate. And that port attach rate, which is the ratio of ports to drivers, has always been too high. Got too many kids in the class for the number of teachers. So where they charge is at home. 80% of EV drivers charge their vehicles at home. High-speed charging is typically limited to travelers, emergencies, folks who live in multifamily housing who don't have charging stations at home, and people who just like the convenience of doing it. But most people charge at home. That market is accelerating just as quickly as the EV sales market, and they also charge at work. So what we're looking at is the travel market, long distance travel, and ultra convenience market. So really, really good question. And the short answer is home. And the longer answer is they love it when they can find high-speed charging at outside locations. We call it being out in the wild, and can charge their vehicles as well.
I mean, at the end of the day, fast charging is about connecting communities. And on top of that, it's about enabling adoption because it builds that consumer confidence. When I got my first EV in 2014, there were no chargers where I live. But as soon as they put them on the corridor and they had them at the office place, it built that confidence that I could make it from point A to B. So again, these build consumer confidence from a marketing and awareness standpoint. It's an extension of your fueling business as the market continues to grow, but it's really about connecting those corridor communities. As Whitney said, the bulk of the charging is going to take place at the residence.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. The other question that came in, is there a limit on how many vehicles can charge using ChargePoint DC charging station?
Do you mean a limit charging concurrently at one time, or like a number of vehicles during the day that's going to deplete a well of energy?
Let's go with the latter. If that,
okay.
They just responded, said daily.
Daily, no. It is only limited by the amount of time that people, it's like tables in a restaurant. It's limited by the amount of time that people stay there, and you know, the number of hours in a day, really. I mean, theoretically, you could have people just one right after the other charge their vehicles. Since this is drawing energy from the grid, and the grid is the best battery we could ever have, energy is constantly available. There is not a limit as long as there is space and time. And there are lots of nuances to how you motivate people to move when they are done charging their vehicle. I'm sure that as convenience store operators, you don't love to see a line of people waiting at the gas pump and empty cars that are done filling up in the store doing, or maybe you do like it, I don't know, because I guess they're buying things, but doing things that aren't making you money. You want to get those guys out of there and get somebody else in. It's the same with EV charging, and there are ways that we can help move those folks along. But the answer to your question is no, there is no limit to how many vehicles can charge during any time period.
Let me jump in here. So ChargePoint has one of the largest networks of stations in North America, and so over 200,000 ports that we can look at today's utilization, and we use that within some of the tools we've built to understand in that predictive modeling of what is utilization. So that's part of that ROI. If you recall that gear slide, we understand what utilization is today. We look at year-over-year adoption rates. We help forecast over that 10-year life cycle of that product of what is that daily utilization look like for that specific site, for that specific market. Again, that goes into that ROI.
Got anything else?
Makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
The individual that asked that question said it was more of a statement. They said great and thank you. So I think you hit it spot on. So I do want to add, just before we conclude here, I do want to add, just for our members that have listened to this, the PPA is currently engaged with our PUC. And ChargePoint is a part of this group as well. But there is an informal working group that is talking about EV rate design through the PUC. Questions like, Brad touched on it earlier, demand charges. How is that addressed? What are policies that are going to be applicable to fuel retailers that are going to encourage investment within the space, if this is something that your organization is considering? We are also, encouraging policies that are going to encourage competition within the marketplace. So that's just something, just so you all are aware. We're in the very early stages of that, but that is something that our association is engaged with as this continues to advance within our state at whatever capacity or rate that may be, right? So just to make you all aware of that, but just a quick plug on the association side in that regard. But with that being said, back to our presentation here today. John, Whitney, Brad, really want to thank you all for your expertise on the topic. Your information was up there at the end. If you're listening to this and you do want to engage with any other follow-up questions with the team from ChargePoint and you don't have their contact information, please get a hold of me and we can absolutely connect you. But before we wrap up here, any final thoughts from your end?
I'll wrap up. Look, we're proud members of PPA now. We started look, I wish it was years and years in the making, but we are now members of PPA. We're also chairman circle members of NACS. We are members of NACS, PEI, So because so much of what PPA does is policy related, and we understand the importance of that. We want to have a role. We want to help develop those the policies that are positive for the industry. Because if it's a good experience, if it's a fruitful landscape, then that means that we can have more customers and sell more stuff, right? So it's important for all of us. And so we are members of PPA. We're members of other organizations, all working in concert to make EV something that can be profitable for all of you into the future. I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that as well. Whitney, Brad, any last thoughts?
No, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to groups like this, and we're very, very pleased to do it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ted.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of the day and take care.